Well, there's two things I want to talk about today. So I can't leave the Joe Biden press conference and I can't just let that go. I know there's going to be lots of other people who talk about it, but considering just last week it was, after the whole China summit thing, I basically spoke about how I think that Joe Biden's decline, his decline in health and vigor, is a good metaphor for the decline of the American empire and of the U.S. establishment. And I think that today's press conference only outlined that ever more boldly. He, for the most part, he kind of, he stumbled through. He didn't totally collapse, but he did have one really bad moment where he completely, lost where he was going and had to just move on to something else. And so the guy's clearly unwell. I think we know that. It was hard to sit through because it got to be very boring. His answers were not, by Joe Biden standards, they weren't horrible. Obviously, anyone else on the planet probably would have handled that press conference better. The reporters were not they were not as ridiculously pro-Biden and friendly as I would have imagined. Now, that's not to say that they were super tough on him as a whole, but just I would expect him to, I would have expected them to give Joe Biden to completely make this a total softball thing to where anything that he did to screw up would have been 100% his own fault. And I'd imagine, though, that all the tough questions were totally pre-planned and that he knew that they were coming. Perhaps that could have been a bit of theater there. An event like this, Joe Biden, it's just a fact. Joe Biden would not have been able to handle this if all these questions were not given to him in advance, at least, in part, if not in all. The first question, I think was the worst one of the entire conference. It was essentially saying, it was phrased to be like a tough question. It's like, hey, Joe, you promised to take away everybody's guns. How are you going to deliver on that with these Republicans who won't comply? Aren't you going to at least ban ghost guns or something? And that was probably the most egregious question, which you always are going to get the worst question first, because the presidency always wants to pick the guy who's going to ask the question to ask the first question, who's going to ask a question that makes the administration look the best. That's who always gets the first question in a press conference. But from there on, there were people, they were asking him about the border stuff and saying how, like, hey, you undid Trump's policies. Don't you think you're somewhat to blame? And he, again, aside from having a couple of bad moments, he did not totally fall apart. Now, what was noticeable was that, this took everything he had for him to do this. I assure you that he has spent the last couple of weeks probably practicing for this. Everything that he did, I'm sure he had to memorize those, and he had, cards in front of him and everything, so that he could just read off his prepared statements and his talking points. But again, even that at this stage for him is very, very difficult. You can tell he had to talk very slowly, and when he got ahead of himself, that's where he lost his place, and that's when he had to start over. And so after that, he kind of regained his composure, but he had to speak very, very slowly, and there was not room. The press couldn't really beat up on him, because had they done that, he would have totally fallen apart. So they had to be very, very gentle to keep from knocking down the straw man that they propped up over the course of the last election and now the first couple of months of the Biden presidency. And you know what? I guess I would kind of equate today to Joe Biden's debate performances. In the way that they were hyped up for a really long time. People were saying for the longest time, oh my gosh, Joe Biden can't handle a debate. He can't do it. He can't do it. He can't do it. It's impossible. And, the Trump campaign was saying that the whole time. And then all of a sudden, the debate rolls around, and, Joe Biden just kind of limps along. He doesn't totally collapse. He doesn't, have a heart attack on stage. And so because of that, people came out of that and said, well, I guess he did pretty good then. Because, they expected him to just do nothing. They expected him to go up there and, take a dump on the podium. And when he didn't do that, everybody was like, wow, that was a great job, Joe. It's kind of like, when your baby takes first steps your baby's not walking too well. They're real wobbly in the legs, and they can't even walk very far. But you go, wow, great job. Because you know what? The standard is crawling at that point. And so if somebody who you've only ever seen crawl, gets up and walks, a couple of feet, that's wow. That's remarkable. And that's what Joe Biden did on the debate stage, and it's what Joe Biden did today. He got nowhere near sort of the bare minimum that you would expect from a fully functioning human being. He was way below that standard. But as far as Joe Biden's concerned, this is probably a win. Because again, this has been hyped up just like the debates, and he waited longer than any president in 100 years, supposedly, basically, and longer than any president, since the birth of broadcast media, I guess, to do this. And he finally comes out and does it. And now that it's over with, now that he's sort of proven, hey, I can stand up behind a podium and answer questions, kind of. Well, now he can go back in the basement and not appear for months. And, when he comes back out, he doesn't have to do another press conference because he already did a press conference. So, what do they care? They're not going to, there's not going to be some statistics cited. What are people going to say? Oh, well, Joe Biden doesn't answer enough questions. It's like, well, they have Psaki out there answering questions every day. What do you need Biden to answer questions for? Now, I guess the big news story out of today is that he said he plans to run for re-election in 2024, which, I don't really think that any reasonable person believes that. And even Biden kind of put qualifiers in there. He's like, well, hey, I never plan 4 years ahead anyway. If I'm able to plan three or 4 years ahead in my life, damn, I'm doing really good. But I'm way too busy for that. But yeah, as of now, yeah, I think I'd run for re-election. But hey, nothing's guaranteed. So he's not running for re-election. That's not going to happen. And if he does, I'll try and remember that I said that, and go back and eat my hat. Or something, whatever it is people do when they're wrong. I'll apologize or something and say, hey, I was wrong. Kind of like I was wrong about how the virus, seemed like it was going to be really, really bad, because we didn't really know back then. I'm really glad that it wasn't nearly that the virus turned out to be, way less severe than I feared, and that it was much more in line with what Dr. Drew, of all people, thought it was going to be way back in January. But anyway, my track record aside, don't count on Joe Biden running for president again. People who are in his condition can go downhill fast. When you get as slow as he is, he's not very sharp right now. And when you get to that stage, within a couple of years, I think he might be at the point to where they can't put him out in public in a press conference. So, he's not going to make it 4 years. And again, it's sad. I don't want to say that. It's a sad thing when people go like that. I'm thinking today of a local radio host in Florida, Ted Webb, who just moved to hospice yesterday, who was on dialysis and has dementia, and he just retired in 2017. And he retired because, he was on dialysis and it was way too much, his diabetes got. And I remember when he was diagnosed with diabetes. It doesn't seem like it was that long ago, and then just bam. It sapped the life out of him, and then all of a sudden now he's got dementia too on top of it. Apparently, just in the last couple of years since he's retired, I don't think he had any, early onset dementia when he was working every day. He was this morning he reminded me a lot like Joe Biden. And this is a local radio host who was calling in to his old show from hospice care, where, on his deathbed, literally, and he sounded about as lucid as Joe Biden. And that's not funny. That's really not funny at all. So honestly, I don't know if Joe Biden makes it through the year. You know what, he probably does. I had a family member who died of dementia. A year before they died, they were not as bad as Joe Biden is right now. But then again, that kind of stuff, it progresses at different rates for different people. But once your mind starts going, and you kind of. Maybe because he's forced to be active every day because he's the president, maybe that'll help keep him young, actually. As long as they don't push him too hard, they can't push him the normal workload of a president. But if he's getting like a quarter of the workload, and he's getting up every day, and they're talking to him, and he's having to think about tough topics, maybe that will help his mind, stay active. Whereas you get some of these people who retire and they're not thinking about anything all day, and then they start to get a little dementia, and I don't know if this is medically true, but I mean, it seems to me like people who just sit around and do nothing all day decline a lot faster. Like that family member I just told you about who died of dementia. Um, he retired, I think, like in his 50s or 60s. He'd done nothing in life for a long time other than just, play golf and watch TV and stuff. And I have I have a grandparent, actually, who is over 90 years old and still works every day, and their mind is, sharp as a tack. And I don't think that those things are entirely, non-correlated. So yeah, the headline is, this is Joe Biden's first press conference as president, but, honestly, it could be his last, because if he gets much worse than he is now, I don't know how they hold him together. People make jokes about, oh, they drug him up, and they hype him up on some cocktail of drugs, and that's what helps him get through it. I don't think that's the case. I mean, he doesn't seem drugged on this. I think that he's slipping away. Now, I guess one last thing that I'll talk about is going back to what I originally started with, Biden's decline as an analog for the decline of the United States. Obviously, any country outside of the U.S. that watched this press conference can see exactly what's going on. Everyone knows it's not, it's not a secret. It's not something that, the American press doesn't talk about it, so nobody knows that, that Joe Biden is on his last leg. Biden is Yuri Andropov. He's worse than Brezhnev. Brezhnev was a very, very old man, but he was around for a few years. Andropov lasted like a couple of years, maybe, in the Soviet Union. And what happened towards the end of the Soviet Union, the 70s and the 80s, was that the old guard was dying off, and they didn't have a new, younger generation that they trusted to replace them. And so their leaders, instead of moving out of the next generation, were just getting older and older, because as one old guy died off, the next oldest guy just rose up to take his place, at the head of the Central Committee. And that's kind of what Biden represents. And I don't mind that personally. I would like Washington to be weakened as much as possible. I mean, there was even one reporter who, asked Biden about the possibility of kicking China out of SWIFT, which, for those of you who don't know, SWIFT is the international, dollar-based payment processing system, and the U.S. kicks tiny little countries out of SWIFT when they want to cripple those countries' economies. Because they know that they're not strong enough to stand on their own, and so if they're kicked out of SWIFT, I mean, it locks up their entire economy as far as international trade is concerned. That was part of what did Venezuela in. Now, Venezuela, didn't need a ton of help to destroy their country. They did quite a bit of it on their own, but getting booted from SWIFT and really getting sanctioned by the U.S. Treasury helped accelerate the collapse of Venezuela, but you would not see the same effect if this was done to China. The U.S. is not in that strong of a position relative to China. China is a very large economy, and so if you kick a very major economy out of SWIFT, you're going to probably do more damage to the global dollar, international trade system than you are to China itself, or at least maybe an equal amount of damage. Because what would China do if they're kicked out of SWIFT? Well, they're going to set up their own payment processing system, and then everyone who wants to do business with China, which is the entire world, would start using China's payment processing system, and all that trade would no longer be being funneled through SWIFT. And that could bring us very close to the end of America, because you would have the dollar being used a lot less overseas. You would have dollars flowing back into the United States. You'd need a lot less dollars, a lot lower supply of dollars to fuel the international trade in dollars that is left. And so therefore, we would get a serious spike in inflation that would be sustained for a decent period that would hike up interest rates, and would pop the bubble. And as I mentioned yesterday, I mean, popping the bubble, that's, at this point, we can't handle that. We pop this bubble, the U.S. is done for. Now, again, I don't think that Biden is bold enough to try something like that, particularly against China. But the fact that these things are being discussed when they're so absurd, I think, is another sign of the decline of the United States. That you have people thinking that these are possibilities, that the U.S. could somehow just sanction China like it's Zimbabwe or something. So those are the important parts of the press conference that I think will not be adequately covered by other people. There's, I'm sure everyone's going to talk probably mostly about the immigration stuff and the gun stuff. And the gun stuff's important, although what I heard out of that, I already discussed the possibility of the ghost gun ban twice now on this channel, so you can go back and find that if you look through the various gun bills. I think the first one I did was something about Biden executive order gun control. If you search for that, you might be able to find it. And then, of course, the video yesterday about Joe Manchin. I talked about the possibility of Biden banning, again, so-called ghost guns. And he said, oh, yeah, it's definitely on the table. Well, yeah, I guess that could happen. But if you've already, people who are into the 80% lowers and stuff, I think they know, a long time ago that they, the time for them to do that stuff was past. They did it. They've got it. And unless the Biden administration does some kind of retroactive, registration type of program, which I don't think they could get away with by executive order, you should be pretty safe. Just think of that as a window that's being closed. It's not apocalyptic. It's not a good thing, certainly. But we'll live to fight another day. To me, that is, I would take that as a loss for the gun grabbers, that out of all this, they're not able to achieve anything more substantial than that. Because, let's be honest, 99% of people who are buying guns are not buying 80% lowers. So yes, it's a loss, but in terms of the volume of guns being manufactured and sold, they're not making a dent. Similar thing to the bump stock ban. Does that affect a whole lot of people? No. Was it a good thing? Absolutely not. It was almost the worst thing that Trump did as president, other than not end any wars. And then as far as the immigration stuff is concerned, nothing really interesting. Biden basically said Trump was a meanie, so they were scared to come here. Now they think I'm a nice guy, so people are coming, and I'm glad that people think I'm a good guy. I'm not upset about that. And he said, but nothing's changed. Everything's the same. It was gobbledygook. There was nothing to really gain from what he was saying. So with that said, I think I will end it there for today.